Since the fall of the Roman Empire, good riddance by the way, cavalry had dominated the European battlefield. Owning a horse was expensive, and learning how to effectively command it in battle required time which only the aristocracy could afford. Medieval battles were decided by the thundering charges of heavily armed knights. That was until the infantry revolution. In the 1400s and 1500s, princes started to raise professional infantry units armed with pikes. They were able to fend off the cavalry charges. The introduction of gunpowder allowed for weaponry that could pierce the knight's metal armor. However, cavalry was far away from obsolete. That wouldn't happen until the advent of machine guns in the early 1900s. On the battlefields of Germany and Poland, heavy cavalry would run down and discipline infantry, like the scythe does chaff. During the 30 Years' War, imperial cuirassiers would sway battles in the Catholic favor under legendary commanders like Pappenheim. In this famous painting depicting the Battle of Kirkholm, we see the Polish hussars steaming over the poorly trained Swedish army. Only 2,600 hussars managed to massacre an army of 8,000 infantrymen and 2,500 horsemen. The Nordic countries lacked the cavalry traditions of continental Europe. The peasantry were free and strong, whereas the nobility were weak, poor, and few in numbers. A horse wants grass and open fields, but the Nordic terrain consists mostly of mountains and forest. Neither had the cold climate developed any impressive breeds of horse. Imperial General Tilly mocked them for their small size. One anonymous writer wrote apologetically of the Swedish horses, saying, "In truth, they are very stout. In consideration of their low stature, exceedingly strong." There was also an issue of equipment. By 1600, European cavalry was divided into two types, cuirassiers and arquebusiers. Cuirassiers were heavy cavalry, kitted out in almost bulletproof armor, and charged into battle with a pair of pistols. Arquebusiers were skirmisher cavalry, armed with a short firearm, the arquebus, sometimes called a carbine. The role of the arquebusier was to support the flanks of the cuirassiers, softening up the enemy before a charge. Dragoons were seen as mounted infantry, and lancers had been abandoned by everyone except the Polish. When Gustavus Adolphus became king, he had been left with a very bad army. If he wanted to beat up the Poles and their hussars, he needed a much better cavalry force. By the time he began his sweeping military reforms, his only permanent cuirassier unit were the Adelsfana, noble banner, composed of feudal knights. Weirdly enough, they were hardly ever called upon in wartime. The rest of Sweden's native cavalry were poorly equipped arquebusiers. Sweden's contemporary industry struggled at kitting them out with guns and armor. Since Gustavus couldn't get enough arquebuses, he decided to just throw them away. Since he didn't have any cuirassiers, there was no point having arquebusiers, whose tactical purpose was to support the cuirassiers. After 1621, his cavalry was supplied only with a pair of pistols and a sword, a back and a breastplate, and an open-faced helmet. The new helmet allowed the cavalryman not only to see better, but also to drink a cold beverage of his choice. Previously, some cuirassiers had a hole in their visor, in which to stick a plastic straw. Gustavus had reverted his cavalry to the light horseman, which had been prevalent in northern Germany during the 1500s. The light horseman was an all-purpose cavalryman. He could carry out both shock attacks and campaign duties. Swedish cavalrymen were divided into regiments, the same way as the infantry, and their campaign battalions consisted of 564 men. 100 of these performed campaign duties, such as guarding the camp or performing reconnaissance. But whilst the light horseman was a jack of all trades, he didn't excel in any field. Indeed, the Gustavian cavalry lacked a distinct purpose, and observers weren't sure what to call them. Some called them cuirassiers, since they carried armor and pistols. The English called them arquebusiers. Eventually, the term Reiter became the most popular. That just means rider in German. Whilst native Swedish infantry were conscripted, the native horsemen consisted primarily of volunteers. These volunteers were social climbers from a rising group of well-off farmers who had combined their farm work with services to the state, such as tax collectors, sheriffs, and innkeepers. Some of these farmers banded together to supply the crown with a cavalryman, a horse, and equipment. In the 1680s, the system became known as Indelningsverket, the allotment system, and would be implemented as the recruitment system for the entirety of the Swedish army. Anyway, Volunteering as a cavalryman was popular, because you'd risk being conscripted as an infantryman anyway. Being a cavalryman seems to have been safer. Whilst most Swedish infantrymen never returned home, half of the national cavalrymen that served in the 30 Years' War returned to Sweden safely. For the rich farmers, it was a game of hazard. If they survived, they could return home with considerable plunder to improve their economic standing. One of the most unique units of Gustavus' army were a company of mounted jägers called djurskyttar, game shooters. They are one of the first jäger units ever recorded. They were established as early as 1611 and served throughout Gustavus' reign. They were recruited from the foresters and game wardens of southern Sweden's royal estates, and each man provided himself with a horse. They were armed with hunting guns called fågelbössor, fowling pieces, made in Småland. They had a small bore of 8 to 10 millimeters, whereas a typical musket had 19 millimeters. However, the fowling piece had a snap-ons lock, a sort of flintlock, and were usually rifled, giving them peerless accuracy. Rifled firearms were an uncommon sight before the Industrial Revolution. Cavalry units were also raised outside of Finland. Gustavus' first lifeguard of cuirassiers contained many Livonians, modern-day Latvians, and was commanded by Jörgen Adrikas. Another Livonian company was commanded by Fabian Aderkas. The old allotment system was especially popular in Finland, where many farmers chose to pay their taxes by supplying the crown with a rider and equipment. For hundreds of years, Finland had been located on the hotly contested and constantly shifting border with Russia. Reports from these frontline conflicts mentions that the Finns and the Sami are sometimes using the bow and arrow, and they were excellent archers. They transported themselves using skis, and were devastating guerrilla fighters against the Russians and Poles. Some said that they had magical powers and could bewitch the enemy. They frequently engaged in cattle rustling, and their horses were greatly improved through the infusion of Eastern blood. Almost half of the national cavalry came from Finland, and they were known for being especially ferocious. Their war cry was HAKKA PÄLLE, meaning hack 'em down. The imperial troops would nickname them Hakkapelites. Today, this unit has become iconic and appears in video games like Civilization and Total War. Contemporary witnesses weren't so positive. German clerics prayed that God would save them from the Agmen horribili Hakkapelitorum, the terrifying march of the Hakkapelites. The Hakkapelites were known for their brutality. Scotsman James Turner wrote that a great many killed in cold blood by the Finns, who professed to give no quarter. Other times, the Finnish cavalry found other ways to enjoy themselves in the enemy territory. They found the southern food much to their liking, compared to the more Spartan diet of the north. A Swedish diplomat wrote that our Finnish boys may not return home to Savolax anytime soon. In Livonia, they were forced to feed on moldy bread with their beer soup. In Bavaria, they make cold soup in their helmets, with wine and puff pastry. Many of the cavalry commanders were Finns as well. Colonel Torsten Stålhandske was probably the most prominent. His name literally means steel glove. The Battle of Breitenfeld was decided after he led his Finnish cavalry in a massive charge and smashed the Imperials' left flank. In 1634 he became Major General of all national cavalry in Germany. Wolke was an ordinary man from a long line of Finnish warriors. Already at the age of 15 he joined the war against Russia. In 1626 he rose to the command of a Finnish cuirassier regiment. Because his name means death in German, he chose his terrifying banner to be a death's head against a black field. His cavalry carried 6 variations of it. For his glories against the Polish, he was personally knighted by Gustavus Adolphus, and in the 30 Years' War he rose to the rank of marshal and royal councillor. Gustavus himself referred to him as the Finnish snowplow. I could really dedicate an entire video to his astounding career, but sadly we don't have the time. A video on this sadly obscure cavalry commander probably wouldn't garner enough clicks, so I don't think I'll ever make it. But not all of the cavalry commanders were Finnish, or even Swedish. Franz Bernhard von Thurn was a Bohemian nobleman who had led the Protestant revolt against the emperor back in 1618. This was the uprising which escalated into the 30 Years' War. Having been forced to flee his home, he now found a place as a commander of the Finnish cavalry. This is further evidence that the 30 Years' War wasn't just a German, but a wider European conflict. He successfully led the cavalry to victory at the Battle of Wallhof in 1626. Swedish infantrymen and cavalry worked closely together to defeat the Poles. This was not only the bloody baptize of the Swedish cavalry, but Gustavus' first great victory. It must have been comical to see the tall Swedes and Finns mounted atop their short and fat horses. As soon as they landed in Poland and Germany, they made attempts to buy better mounts. But at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Imperial General Tilly pointed out that the Swedish cavalry were so badly mounted that our baggage boys had better horses than them. Gustavus didn't exactly like that, and kicked Tilly's butt during the battle. With the open fields of central Germany now unlocked, the king could acquire new and excellent horses. He always gave preferential treatment to his national cavalry. In the summer of 1632, mercenary horses starved in the stables, because Gustavus wouldn't give them sufficient fodder over his own troops. The main weapon of the cavalryman was the wheellock pistol. It was expensive to produce, but was more accurate than alternatives, and had a very low chance of misfire. They were loaded with 1 or 2 bullets, shotgun pellets, or a rectangular bullet called a slug. Cavalry units had previously used a tactic called caracole, where they rode up close to the enemy, discharged their pistols, then rode off to reload. By the 1620s, Gustavus and the German princes had abandoned the caracole. The Gustavian cavalry rode close, discharged their pistols, then drew their swords and waded into melee. The hard handle of the pistol could be used as a club. They also used a long-barreled pistol with a musket stock, called kortgevär, roughly meaning short musket. However, there was a shortage of pistols amongst the Swedish cavalry. Some historians believe this to be the reason why Gustavus abandoned the caracole, in favor of a more melee-centric Polish tactic. Their principal arm became the sword. They were distinguished by their S-shaped quillon. It became known as the Swedish sword, even though most were imported from the Netherlands. Since the imperial cavalry were so heavily armored, Gustavus instructed his horsemen to perform a special strike to kill the enemy horse. Swedish cavalrymen were supposed to wear a back and breastplate, but many chose not to wear armor at all. Most engagements were skirmishes, which required maximum mobility. There was also a constant issue of supplying armor. Also, note that the armor of this period was seldom shiny and blank. It had been treated with acid and was black. Imperial cuirassiers plated in all black armor must have looked terrifying. It has been suggested that leather buff coats were used by the Swedish cavalry, since they were otherwise popular during the 30 Years' War. Whilst Gustavus himself wore one, made from moose leather, most Swedish cavalrymen dressed only in their clothes. Each regiment of horse produced their own riding jackets, and they wore the same color. For example, the Western Geats had yellow and blue coats. The Eastern Geats had yellow coats, and the Uplanders had yellow and black. However, unlike the infantry, sightings in the field of uniformed cavalry are extremely rare. If the cavalry received uniforms, they either mixed them with non-uniform garments, or the uniforms must have been of an unremarkable color like grey. Some cavalry regiments were known by a color, such as the Red Regiment of Horse, but this referred only to flag colors. Each company of a cavalry regiment had its own standard, which by the late 1620s was called a cornet. It was made from a patterned damask silk and carried on a fluted lance. I keep saying this in every video, but Gustavus' best trait was his use of cooperation, in every facet from the civilian to the military. His battlefield tactics revolved around combined arms. The cavalry worked closely together with the infantry. They relied on a musket salvo to soften up the enemy before delivering their brutal charge. At the Battle of Grozno in 1629, the Swedish cavalry proved that it was able to defeat their Polish counterparts. However, in Germany, their abilities have been much exaggerated. The small Swedish horses were outclassed by the fearsome imperial cuirassiers. Gustavus feared the cuirassiers. Before Breitenfeld, he ordered Stål Handske to "Charge me those black fellows soundly, for they are the men that will undo us." Even when supported by infantry firepower, the Gustavian cavalry could fall flat. At Lützen they took a hammering, and one Englishman wrote, "Had not our foot stood like a wall, there had not a man of us come off alive. Our horse did but poorly." Without the firepower, they would probably have stood no chance at all. The Gustavian cavalry was a flexible cavalry unit. It could carry out reconnaissance and win victories on the battlefield. But tactically, it was beaten by more specialized cavalry, and was dependent on the support of infantry musketeers. No single unit of Gustavus' army carried the day. it was cooperation between its units, combined arms, which won the day. This was very much in line with Swedish society as a whole. The estates worked together to gather their meager resources and do something with them. Compare that to the Polish army and society. The army was carried by its hussars. When they were defeated, the poor infantry couldn't do much. In a similar fashion, Polish society was never able to truly get together and cooperate and centralize. If you enjoy the content I produce, consider supporting me monetarily on Patreon. You'll find the link in the video description. Otherwise, please give the video a like and a comment, so that YouTube will show it to more potential viewers. And why not share it with a friend? Cheers.